I'm Peter Kolchinsky, Managing Partner of RA Capital Management. I'm an investor, a scientist, and a food allergy parent. So food allergies are personal for me, as they are for many. And in each episode of this monthly podcast, I'll be speaking with a dynamic thought leader about the grand human quest to conquer food allergies. We'll explore the science of food allergies and technologies to prevent, diagnose, and treat them, as well as the complexities of public policy, insurance, business models, and simply human behavior that, like many entrepreneurs know, can kill seemingly good ideas. So join me and let's talk to the brightest minds on the planet about the food allergy solutions we already have and what's on the horizon. Welcome to Future in Sight. I would like to introduce our first guest, on this podcast series, Dr. Wayne Shrefler. He's the director of the Food Allergy Center at Massachusetts General Hospital, MGH, in Boston. He's a division chief of pediatric allergy and immunology at MGH. He's an associate professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. He's an associate member of the Broad Institute. Basically, Wayne is on the cutting edge of the food allergy field. He's also a medical advisor of research at FAIR. And maybe most importantly for this podcast, Wayne's also my daughter's doctor. So that's really important to note here, because this podcast, it's not going to be just all about, facts and science and cutting edge this and that. That's actually not all that food allergy is about. It's also going to be about how to make all that available to patients with the right kind of empathy. I can't tell you how much of really looking after a kid with food allergies and really looking after a family where somebody you love has a food allergy, right? It's the way my wife and I react, to the allergy. Like, we've got to be in sync. You just have to have a doctor that's able to give you knowledge in the right way and empathize. And if somebody's just flooding you with facts, that doesn't mean that they're equipping you with a judgment that you need. So full credit, to Wayne, these past several years. He's really helped us understand when to react, when not to react, and why. You get a little bit of redness there on the lips, and you kind of freak out. You're like, what could this be? Is this the beginning of, some kind of a reaction? And I can, text Wayne and call him. Not everybody can. So I do consider it a really special privilege that, he'll respond to me, and he'll give us more knowledge with which to diagnose what's going on and figure out whether to, be nervous or relaxed that it's probably nothing. Some doctors, they'll just say, well, I don't want to assume that liability. So if you're worried, go to the ER. That's not a great way to live. So I thought maybe that's a good note to start on, Wayne. How about it? Let's talk about, how much of this have you observed being the science, and how much of it is the psychology and empathy of helping people manage anxiety?
Yeah, I think it's got to be, probably 8 or 9 to 10 in favor of, the empathy, and the buzzword these days is shared decision making and personalized care. And I think hopefully we get wiser with age, right? And so you and I guess, are getting wiser, and you learn over time, that you're really trying to serve a family as a hopefully knowledgeable advisor. So I sort of regard my role as being up on, the science, so that I can make evidence-based recommendations where I can. But you learn pretty quickly in specialty care, certainly in food allergy, but I think this is true in a lot of, aspects of medicine, that there's often a gap between, sort of the studies and where things stand, and generalizing them, though, to the patient that's right in front of you. Sometimes we've got a really good evidence base to answer a specific question. Sometimes there's a lot more, kind of judgment call, and different families who are all, rational, reasonable, are going to come out on different, places on some of those judgment calls. And so my role is really, to sort of support that decision. So.
No, it strikes me listening to you that, this must be a little bit like COVID, where everybody's trying to figure out, like, is this okay? Can I go hang out with my neighbors if one of them sneezed once, and it's like, there's only so much science, with which to answer, and a lot of judgment. What do you think? Do you see the parallels there to COVID for families that lived with food allergies?
Yeah, I do. In fact, I've told some of my families, you guys have a leg up on this because you're sort of more accustomed than a lot of families with young kids in kind of negotiating this space, trying to make, decisions about a low risk but potentially, high consequence, kind of event balanced against quality of life. And I think. And you see this, right? Some people are profoundly uncomfortable with lack of certainty and want, basically to be told exactly what to do, and will err often on the side of being pretty conservative. Others, really want to know exactly where's the evidence and where is the opinion, and then make a decision within there. So yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels, and we're all confronting this. But I think in some ways, patients with chronic medical issues, and food allergy in particular being one where, basically, every day your child is healthy, normal kid, they just live with this kind of low probability risk issue.
And there's something of a partisanship, I find, when it comes to food allergies and, of course, COVID, right? Families that just
all too, unfortunately, right?
Yeah, like families that don't know what it is to live with this, you talk to them before your kid goes over to their house for a play date, and you're like, so what kind of foods do you have? And they're like, oh yeah, no, we're fine. We don't have, nuts or whatever it is. It's like, yeah, but it's also sesame. What do you? And they just kind of think that maybe you're going overboard, right? And you're like, I probably am going overboard, but it's my kid. It's my kid's life. And honestly, this play date's not worth it. And you're thinking of just canceling it, and they're thinking you're crazy, right? And the same deal for families today, where some wear masks and others are like, I don't know what the big deal is. We're all young, right? So I wonder, when did we all learn to be so hyper aware and anxious? Because I think the actual rate of death among people diagnosed with food allergies from an actual food-related anaphylactic event is 1 or 2 out of 1,000,000, per year, right? It's actually really low, but, we're all riddled with anxiety and hyper aware and retreat from certain restaurants and situations, trying to protect ourselves. When did this set in?
Yeah, I mean, well, I came out of my fellowship training, in 2000, and I trained at Mount Sinai with a now giant in the field named Hugh Sampson, who was one of the first kind of clinicians and clinical researchers to really begin to characterize food allergy. And I don't, in part, your question is a really large societal one that goes well beyond my qualifications to address, because I think, it's part of this general trend towards society being, fairly risk averse. I think that at least it feels to me like we've been witnessing over the last few decades. Food allergies certainly fit into that. And and at the time when I came out of training, for example, it was, basically evidence of food allergy early on, or even just, kids that were at high risk because of family history or other allergic conditions, avoid sort of everything, avoid egg till 18 months, avoid milk till a year, avoid nuts until 3 years. And in retrospect, that's turned out to be the wrong advice, we now know from randomized controlled trials, but it's indicative of I think, a mistake that we sometimes make in medicine, which is to err on the side of caution. And, I'll push back a little bit, on just so that, some of your listeners, aren't the first to point it out. Let's point it out ourselves. I mean, part of why the risk of food allergic reactions is in that, kind of one or a handful per million patient years, is probably because, we train people to be careful and to have epinephrine autoinjectors. But it is also the case at the same time that, most allergic reactions, even severe ones, people recover. Obviously, I'm not going to leave my patients in harm's way and tell them, anything other than treat systemic reactions as you should. But I think there's something about, the low probability, high consequence risk that really gets at, kind of the center of our anxiety, most of us, and there's going to be varying degrees to which that's true. But I think society has kind of gone that way. Yeah.
It's just like COVID, right? It's the actual risks of dying from it are low. I think early on it was established that it was probably about a 1% risk, but not evenly distributed. People who were older had comorbidities, had a higher risk of it. But the idea that there's something out there that even could affect 30 or 40-year-olds, it made everybody say, I can do something about this. I don't have to accept this risk. I can retreat from the world. And so it's this combination of a small risk, but one you can do something about, that causes people to live a different life, right?
Right.
And that life itself is in some ways burdensome and isolating. It means you got to buy your cupcakes at a different place, and you have to send your kid to birthday parties where the parents of those kids know, that everybody has to bring the safe cupcakes, at least until your kid can sort of be really hyper aware, for him or herself. Right. So you're right. It's the way we react to these tail risks. But, like 200 years ago, did people even know about food allergies?
Not in this sort of societal kind of public health way, that we know now, that's for sure. It was known, right? There were documented anaphylaxis into ancient times. There were known, food anaphylactic events and even deaths recorded in the medical literature, for sure. But it wasn't something, probably in part because the recognized prevalence and incidence, and probably the true prevalence and incidence, was significantly lower, certainly if you go back 200 years. But yeah, it did not have the kind of, public awareness, obviously, that it does now. And again, I think you're right. I mean, I think people are looking for ways to take control. And there's lots that's good about public awareness being higher, because it leads to, changes in environment that are of, reasonable consequence for increased safety. But I think 200 years ago, food allergy, I mean, even 50 years ago, right? I mean, when you and I were school age, most of us didn't know, anyone that had even the most common food allergies that are present now.
They certainly didn't name them food allergies, but, somebody would probably say like, oh, my lips tingle or whatever it is. I bet hundreds of years ago, there were plenty of people that knew that certain foods made their mouth itch or something, and maybe they avoided those foods, right? And today you have that as well. You get, families that know their kid has a food allergy. Do they have an EpiPen? No. Do they check the ingredients of every single food? No. And every once in a while, the kid reports feeling something, and their lips swell or whatever, but the family maybe doesn't react very strongly to that. They know it'll pass. And there's I kind of envy those families, like, to be able to be so easygoing about that, because my family's pretty aware. And so somewhere in the last couple hundred years, and I know there've been some experiments just in the last century, people started to put two and two together, that the things we were seeing happen that were sort of mild, like swelling of lips or tongue or something like that, and then the very serious risk of anaphylaxis that might kill you, they're part of the same underlying phenomenon, right? Mm-hmm. Antibody-driven immune reactions to food. I think there was one guy, and maybe you remember the name, took some blood out of a person with a food allergy, injected into his own skin, and then did a scratch test, like a pinprick test with the food allergen, and could transfer that skin reaction from the person who had food allergies to himself. So now, there's some biological thing going on. But before that, I got to imagine it was like, worrying about bacteria before the advent of germ theory. You didn't even know what you were talking about. You didn't give the right name to anything.
Yeah, well, we didn't, so IgE antibody, as you know well, is the underpinning, kind of molecule that the immune system produces, the class of antibody that is responsible, from that whole range, from mild reactions to full-blown anaphylaxis, or many of the kinds of mild reactions that people experience. And that wasn't discovered until 1967, right? That experiment that you're talking about, it was these two Germans, Prausnitz and Kutzner, that did in 1921 that transfer experiment. So Kutzner had fish allergy. Prausnitz injected some of his serum into his belly. Waited a day, ate fish. Had a local hive, and that was so. There was this demonstrated phenomenology, right, where you could transfer this aspect of immune specific sensitivity. That preceded the actual discovery of the molecule that was responsible for it by, several decades. And we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of discovery of IgE, in 2017, 2016. It's pretty recent, still. And you made the point in the case of COVID and how we deal with it, that we understand risk to be kind of stratified by age and underlying conditions. But we're not good even now at predicting, who is only going to have a mild reaction or who might have a more severe reaction, with a few, interesting exceptions like what we call oral allergy syndrome. And so that, also gets to the heart of people's anxiety, right? Because, in the case of being a young, healthy adult in the age of COVID, you may be masking more to be a good citizen and to help, stop spread and things like that. But you have a sense of being at lower risk yourself. In the case of food allergies, we're not really able to arm our patients very well with some of that, kind of knowledge, because we lack the tools to really do that in a meaningful way. And so that also feeds part of the beast.
I mean, the advent of that bit of knowledge, IgE, right? It allowed us to start testing people.
Right.
And as soon as you start testing people, you discover that, there's several percent of kids that are going to test positive for food allergies based on, this IgE titer or based on a skin test, right? And, why would they even go and seek that? Well, it must have been that you heard that, hey, if you see a reaction on your skin, go get yourself checked out. They've got these newfangled tests that will tell you if you've got food allergies. And so all of a sudden you get this label, your kid has a food allergy. So it means that what was previously a few in a million chance of some random person, or I guess it was like I think the background rate is 0.03 to 0.3 per million in the population. There's only, I think, a few hundred people who die of food allergies in the US each year, like a couple 100,000 ER visits, but only a few hundred who die. And all of a sudden you find yourself in the enriched group that have food allergies. Everybody else is, sort of given a pass. It's like, oh, you don't have food allergies, you're fine. But those that are told you've got food allergies, for you, it now becomes an enriched risk of death. Still small, but you suddenly feel like, how should I live my life, doc? Right? And so and I think that's where you mentioned that, one of the early reactions to this, I think it kicked in, in the 80s, was that people would be told, like, in order to keep your kid from developing these allergies, which we can see are rampant based on these antibody tests, like from the early months, don't feed him any of these foods.
Right? Yeah. So, if there's a family history or other allergic conditions, or, I would, so, coming out of fellowship 20 years ago, very typical patient would be, say a toddler who, had pretty severe eczema, maybe, some history of reactivity to egg. And we would automatically do a test for, all the major allergens that they hadn't introduced yet. And then everything that was positive was pretty much assumed, in those days, to be an allergen, and you were generally advised to, restrict them And even things that we didn't test for or that might be negative that were in a high risk category like tree nuts or shellfish, you were told to avoid till 3. So there's sort of a iterative and unfortunately forward feeding cycle here where the intervention we now know made things worse, because avoidance in the face of sensitization to something that you might tolerate actually increases the chance a couple years down the road that now you truly are allergic. And so we've actually made the problem worse. Now, fortunately, for the last few years, because of some landmark studies, we're doing better with that, but it's still an issue. I mean, I saw a patient today, Peter, who, has a couple of well-known food allergies, somewhat anxious parent, but totally reasonable, understands the importance of keeping foods in the diet. Child experienced, although eating cashew regularly, got it on the chin and got a contact hive. And here we are. Okay, do we test for evidence of IgE in this kid or not? And so we had the discussion, and I'm concerned about making you more worried about cashew when he's clearly been tolerating it. And I think we should keep it in the diet. But I understand that you want to, you may want to know whether there's evidence of IgE here. She wanted to know. We did the test. It's positive. We're going to keep cashew in the diet, but do I worry that now I've kind of planted a seed where that mom is going to be second guessing every time she feeds cashew? For sure. Is it possible that in that decision-making process, we could have, unintentionally made something worse? It's quite possible. So, I'm going to follow that family really closely and be in close dialogue with them and really work to kind of keep that food in the diet if it's appropriate to do so. I think we all have a tendency maybe to overestimate our sense of control. That kid might have been going toward a cashew allergy no matter what we do. Intervention by regular feeding clearly helps, proven by randomized controlled trial in the case of peanut. But some kids are going to develop allergy anyway. So, that's the other aspect of this, is that, we've become accustomed to having a lot of control in our lives. And if we can't, keep it under control, that's particularly frustrating. I mean, it really, it feels like a fail.
A few hundred years ago, a kid might have eaten some cashews for like the 50th time as a kid, right? And maybe would have, developed some redness or swelling or itching around the mouth, whatever it is. And the parents would have ignored it. They wouldn't have, thought cashews, and the kid would have just like continued eating cashews through it and never developed an actual cashew allergy, right? I would describe that as ignorance is bliss, right? And now we have this little bit of knowledge. We know that, it's possible. It's possible if this is the beginnings of a cashew allergy. And you test for it, you look for the signs. And if you want to convince yourself in that moment, yep, my kid has a cashew allergy, I'm going to stay away from cashews, then this is the perverted thing about, food allergies. By avoiding the cashews, you're, likely increasing a risk of your kid actually having that food allergy, right? So the very thing you fear, you make it so. And it takes a ton of fortitude. We went through this with our second child, with Val. Remember that time that I called you and I was like, oh, Val was just eating, I can't remember what it was, and we thought maybe his lip was a little bit discolored and a little bit swollen. And you guided us through, smearing a little bit of it on his skin, looking for that kind of reaction, just trying to figure out, like, was that just something, random, or might it be the signs of it? Because we didn't want to stop feeding him that food and, increase the odds of him actually developing that food allergen. And the amount of time that it took from us, and frankly from you, when I think about 4 million kids born every year, if every parent out there was as hypervigilant, as we were, and I don't think we overreact to this, I just think, a little knowledge can be held. I just don't know that we've got the physician hours, in America to deal with that much anxiety. We need more knowledge. We need better tools. Let's talk about that.
We do.
What do you think the future might look like to ultimately allow us to be as knowledgeable or more knowledgeable than we are, because you can't go back to ignorance. No matter how much we want to hit ourselves over the head with a rock, like you can't unlearn this stuff. What might the future look like 20, 30 years from now if all the technologies that you're tracking, maybe work out? Can you paint that vision for us?
Yeah, well, I can, take a stab at it. I mean, the usual caveats of, trying to predict the future, but I think you're right. We can't put the genie back in the bottle. We're not going to return to a time where we're, just able to ignore that all. I mean, witness, I'm a fairly, in my practice, strong proponent of keeping foods in diet and not testing unless we're really going to act on it. And yet, I could easily pull an anecdote just from this morning of a test that I worried, maybe wasn't the right thing to do. So we can't go back. People want to know, they want knowledge. I think, what I think is a promising area and look forward to more research on is really going the other direction, understanding, the immune system in more granular detail. When we do a traditional IgE test, it's like taking, the average height of, 10-year-old boys in Cambridge or something. It's a gross measure of kind of a population of IgE, even when you're looking at, the IgE to a specific food. And there are hints and insights already that, looking at specific proteins in foods, so-called component allergen testing, that has represented a modest but tangible advance in diagnosis, over the past few years. And there are labs now around the country that are further dissecting that immune response, looking at, specific binding sites on proteins, so-called epitopes.
What might that do? Let's say that we characterize these antibodies really well. How might that change things?
I think it's going to give us a handle. I'm guardedly optimistic. It's going to help us better predict who is really at risk for anaphylaxis versus, at lower risk for anaphylaxis. It's going to help us do some of what, we can do in the context of COVID, stratify risk more meaningfully. Right now, you have a reaction that's consistent with an immediate one, even if it's pretty mild. You have a positive test, you get an EpiPen, you avoid, unless there's OIT, and that's another part of, what's coming.
And by OIT, just for the audience, that's oral immunotherapy. So taking some of the allergen every day orally in order to sort of become more tolerant to it.
Right. So these evolutions in tests, I think on the antibody side, also, similar kind of work happening on the T cell side, I think might provide some, modest gains in better stratifying risk.
But let me make sure that I make it really feel actionable for the audience. So right now, they say something like 8% of all kids have a food allergy. I believe that would be like a diagnosed food allergy if you went in and you got it checked out and they did the skin test and oral challenge and they'd be like, yep, you got a food allergy. That's a lot. However, that does not mean that that's 8% that are like every day under threat of death, right? The chance of dying is still incredibly low. And so with these antibody tests, do you think we might be able to concentrate that down like tenfold and maybe have it be like 0.8% of people that are told, no, you for real have a food allergy, with like all the right IgEs for it. And the other 7.2%, you're going to get reactions, but don't worry, it'll never be too serious. Is that kind of the stratification we're talking about?
Probably, I would be a little bit more modest than that in the coming, couple decade time span. I think one of the hard things is that there's a lot of variability in the circumstances, right, of someone's reaction. So, perfect storm type things, large dose exposure, already kind of, compromised health for whatever reason, or cofactors like, cardiovascular activity or coexisting morbidities like asthma. So, so I don't want to propose that, even these more advanced tests looking in finer detail are going to kind of be able to tell us that here's someone who will never have a severe reaction. versus someone who's, clearly at risk of, a really horrendous event. It's going to be, I think, a little more subtle than that. But what I do think is quite likely is that it'll be, we'll be able to say, okay, we can see that this range of, antibody diversity puts you at, higher risk for a severe event, all things being equal. And therefore, we're going to focus our, kind of most advanced interventions or our time and attention with regard to education, on you.
But folks, so I think a lot of people already live their lives as if they're in that high risk group, right? Because they don't know any better, so they basically.
And we don't know any better. Yeah.
Right. So I'm kind of wondering, do you think that by having these tests that tell you who the true highest risk folks are, that allows you to dramatically reduce the anxiety of everybody else? Or because that's hard, right? To say like, well, look, I can't eliminate your risk. You're still, have some kind of food allergies, but don't worry, you're not in the worst camp. What does that mean for people? Like, can they just happily go to a Chinese restaurant and order off the menu, or are they still going to be like, yeah, I think I'm gonna, stick with those?
Yeah, it's a hard question, Peter, and it's the right question to be asking for sure. I think that it will help us, for example, say to this family, you really are at low risk from cross-contamination events. You know what I mean? That like, based on our knowledge of, what's typically in manufactured products and because we know for sure, there've already been studies, I've been part of some of them where we know that, 90% of patients will tolerate, say 1 milligram of protein. That's actually a very small amount at the same time that it's a fairly significant amount in the context of cross-contamination. And so
short of like, don't eat peanut butter and don't eat peanut brittle, but if it doesn't have peanuts in the ingredients, don't worry about only buying foods that were made at a peanut-free facility.
Sure. It's the difference between having to avoid products, with declared allergen, which is going to be the case for, most, versus, really need to worry about cross-contamination events. And we already know that most people don't have to worry about those, but we don't have a test that really allows us to identify who's who. Another example could be, that if you have a more benign prognostic test, you might actually be the kind of person that if you did this oral immunotherapy that we discussed, we really might be able to accelerate you to the point where you can ad lib consume and live your life like someone who's not allergic. Versus for you, even if we do, this form of therapy right now, you're probably going to only achieve, protection from anaphylaxis perhaps, but you might not tolerate the therapy as well. And it's not likely to do any better than that. And for you, you're really the person we need to target in, that clinical trial of biologic XYZ, because we need to do better for you. So I think it's going to be stratifying in those kinds of ways. I think part of it will hopefully help people, here and now in their day-to-day decision-making. But I think it's also going to help, the field understand, the jargon term is endotypes, right? The endophenotypes within the food allergic population that ultimately we'll begin to understand are more or less likely to really benefit from
we stop calling it. So we stop calling it one disorder, one disease.
Right.
We start giving it its own subtype names, right?
Exactly.
Cancer, it's different kinds of cancers. There's type 1 and 2 diabetes. Actually, There's probably more than one type of diabetes, even within type 2 diabetes, right? So the more we parse this, more finally, the more we're able to understand the course of each person's type of food allergy. So you mentioned treatment, I bet a lot of the folks listening to this podcast probably have some familiarity with food allergies, but in case we have a broader audience, I think it's worth mentioning that food allergy treatment historically has been to actually expose people to food allergen. So, it's kind of like the old fairy tales about the wizard who took a little bit of poison every day or something like that in order to make himself resistant to poison and couldn't be poisoned, or snake charmers who get bitten so much that they become resistant to snake venom. You are literally giving patients the very thing that they fear in order to get them more and more tolerant to it. There's, I guess, injected therapy, there's oral therapy, can you tell us a little bit about what's that field been like? How is it practiced? How standardized has it been? And then, lead up to the first FDA approved product.
Yeah, it's interesting because you said, historically it's been to expose people to small amounts, and that's true. And yet it's a pretty recent history, so the history, actually, even going back to some of, the seminal investigations and of, that, like the, transfer of immediate hypersensitivity that we talked about, and early, vaccinologists. Some of them, were studying, vaccinology for hay fever alongside of infectious disease before we really even knew what we were doing. So the origins of immunotherapy in the field of allergy are, sort of a century old. But for food allergy, like when I came out of training, the advice was carry an EpiPen and avoid the food. And then, there had been efforts as early as the late 90s to do some injection immunotherapy in a more systemized, actually controlled trial. There were sort of anecdotal reports of people doing desensitization to foods. The rate of adverse events when people tried basically traditional injection-based immunotherapy for peanut allergy was just unacceptably high. And so pretty quickly people started looking at other routes, and the thing that emerged was, mucosal or oral exposure. There was both sublingual and oral. Oral immunotherapy tends to be higher doses. You're just actively eating it. Sublingual, the idea is it's smaller amounts. You're holding it in the mouth. It's thought to maybe stimulate different cells of the immune system. They mechanistically, I think most of us feel like they're very, very similar. Sublingual route is also used for environmental allergies. So, that really got going, in the late 90s in some small studies into the 2000s and 2010. And it led to, ultimately a company that actually FAIR helped to found that brought a, GMP, so a pharmaceutical grade peanut flour to, through the FDA process and a successful phase 3 clinical trial. But the endpoint, that they won approval on the basis of is, important to understand as essentially what we sometimes just refer to as bite safety. So, raising the threshold at which a person experiences a reaction, reducing the severity of the reaction. That's what this peanut oral immunotherapy product has been approved on.
You at a small dose, right, of a very well characterized product made under, as you pointed out, GMP, quality control practices, so that like batch to batch, you're always getting the exact same amount of peanut protein in there, and you escalate the amount that you give people, and every day that you're taking, I don't know, like 600 milligrams of it, because you made it through that day, that you can tolerate 600 milligrams, right? And the presumption being, if you can do 600 milligrams, and if later on in the day you happen to bite into something that has half a peanut's worth of peanut in it, you'll be fine. You'll survive it, right? So what if you were to, get that exposure through something other than taking a pill every day? What if, because those patients are kind of ingesting the very thing they're afraid of. And, there have been some patients in the clinical trials that actually needed to take a hit of an EpiPen, and you fear that you're going to have an anaphylactic event. So the idea of being able to get that as a patch seems, desirable, but how do you know whether you're protected if you're not taking something orally every day?
Well, the answer to that really has been, what the trial for the patch used, which is a food challenge. So the patch, just for, you'll probably go into this in more detail with future speakers in your podcast, but the patch was developed by a French company. It has, a few hundreds of micrograms of protein, in contrast to the, hundreds of milligrams. So, 1,000-fold less, more or less. And it's applied to the skin every day, and a little bit of allergen is absorbed and seen by the immune system, and we can see that there is an immune response that's provoked by that exposure. And we can see that on average, people experienced an improvement in that same measure, the so-called eliciting dose. Do a food challenge before the intervention. Yeah, on average, not everyone.
You just don't know where you fall, the above average
and we still, and we don't indeed, just like we talked about the limitations of testing now for predicting things like reaction severity, we don't have a good biomarker, as it's referred to predict who is going to do better with this therapy or not. So it's an area of active research.
What's this food challenge like? And I'm asking you a total question. We have taken our daughter in for a food challenge.
I should probably ask you, what's a food challenge like?
I actually asked my wife. She was there with my daughter for it. Let me ask you to paraphrase it this way. What has it been like for you to observe, so many parents and so many children through this food challenge where they nervously bring their kid in, and even though they've been avoiding a given food like the plague, you and your staff come up to the kid and say, all right, now put this in your mouth.
Yeah.
And let's see if your throat closes up.
Yeah. I mean, so I just, I again just came from clinic this morning and supervised a couple food challenges literally, a couple hours ago. And, it is an incredibly brave thing for these kids to do. And the older they get, or the parents, right? So the burden shifts a little bit, or it's more shared as the kids get older. Part of the reason, that we do this in the office is obviously for safety, but part of the reason is also that there's going to be, so often some subjectivity to what people experience as they get, more anxious about doing it, that we're there in a way to kind of help interpret the signs and symptoms that they are experiencing or exhibiting, and doing the vital signs and corroborating, what someone may feel. And indeed, even then, 2 to 3% of all the challenges we do, we end up regarding as indeterminate, because there were enough, complaints that we can't really differentiate between anxiety versus an objective reaction without pushing the patient further than we think is appropriate in a clinic setting for, essentially the purpose of being able to add a food to the diet. Even more extreme in the research setting, Peter, where we bring people in for these trials and, we have every reason to think that they have not outgrown the food allergy, right? When we're doing food challenges in clinic, it's generally because we're hoping that that the child can now tolerate the food. In the research setting, we have every reason to think they can't tolerate it, even at the very low dose that we're giving. And reactions can be intense, So, fortunately, I feel very comfortable saying, look, this is a safe procedure. We know what we're doing. This is, the reactions are manageable, but it's a terrible and crude diagnostic procedure, quite frankly, right? I mean, how many other fields basically, even have to do clinical trials this way, right? Basically making the person sick, then trying the treatment, and then making them sick again and hoping they're less sick. It's kind of, it's anti-therapeutic, right? There's a lot of us wonder if it actually undermines the efficacy readout, because we're basically making people go through a reaction before we start the intervention that might help them. We probably would have better efficacy. Well, that might be a little overstated, but it's at least a interesting hypothesis that outcomes might actually look better if we didn't have to do that challenge up front.
I think it should tell the audience, the state of the field, right? Yeah. That you're indeed asking these questions. I think it makes sense that you're asking them. Do we have any hope of being able to get to the same answer as a food challenge, but without actually having to give the food challenge?
Yeah, there is some hope. So actually, there's a little bit of FAIR sponsored research to follow. This is going to Alexandra Santos, and she, among others, we did some of this research early on as well, have shown promising data that looking at a class of allergy cells that are easily sampled from the blood and can be stimulated correlates pretty well with challenge outcomes. And I think that might be a real adjunct. It's been a little bit difficult because that assay, as it's currently conceived, relies on fresh blood. It's been a little bit hard to implement as a easily available commercial test, but that's definitely a solvable problem. I mean, if a company were to take it on, Cecilia Barron at Mount Sinai has some, innovative research looking at ways to basically decouple when you stimulate the blood and when you analyze it so that you can do it without that kind of constraints, logistical constraints. That part's all solvable. Fundamentally, the biology there is sort of like allowing you to get a sense of at least part of that variability between people in a test tube. And I think there are going to be other examples like this.
Yeah. So Aimmune's, peanut, I guess now it's been bought by Nestle, but peanut treatment, it took a fair bit of time and money, to develop this one treatment that
that was pun intended, I assume, a fair amount of time and money.
Yeah, you can assume that absolutely every fair-related thing I say is some sort of a pun meant to promote the organization. I'm big into dad jokes, actually. So there's a lot of food allergens, though. So is it practical for us to develop, an allergen-specific, tolerization regimen like we did for peanut for each and every one of them? Do we even know what the underlying allergens are for all of them?
The one bright spot actually in the field has been, the characterization of the actual proteins from these different food sources. That's come a long way. And for all of the major allergies at this point, we do know the answer to that question. However, unfortunately, no, I think for patients with multiple food allergy, it does begin to strain feasibility to, put all of our eggs in kind of an allergen specific therapy for all of them. There's also going to be, I think in some ways, the more options, the better, right? There may be some families that, in the best possible of worlds, if we have multiple options, one of which might be, wonder drug X that can really wipe out all of your allergens, but maybe is relatively a newcomer and there's concerns about long-term safety because it's new, and option Y is, a series of allergen specific treatments that are kind of been around longer. It'd be great to have, all of those choices. And there are, there's a lot of interest in a molecule called Omalizumab, which is, a monoclonal antibody that targets IgE. It's been around for 15 years to treat asthma. There are other anti-IgEs, coming out. Right? That's Xolair. That
brand name Xolair, for asthma, but has indeed been tested over the years in a number of trials and shows that it can just suppress your IgE and make you much less reactive, towards whatever food allergy you have. So I was going to ask you that next. I'm glad you brought it up. Why is it not enough? I mean, it's a once every 2 week. What is it? A subcutaneous injection. Right. That's not terrible. I mean, people with diabetes do much more than that. Could this just treat every food allergy?
I think I think for some people it might be a treatment option that they would be ready to embrace right now. It probably will skew a little bit to, older kids and adults. It is a needle, that's a barrier, practically speaking, for some. And it's also, I think, I think I still have my eyes on the holy grail of actually, something that really is, what we call immune modulating, just because we love jargon, but essentially more curative, an intervention you can make, even if it takes months or years, but that really alters the natural history of the disease and makes it go away. And because we see this spectrum naturally occurring, right? So, we think of peanut allergy as being a lifelong allergy, but 20% of people outgrow it, right? And so it gets back to that endophenotype thing we were talking about. If we could,
do they know that they outgrew it?
Well, some do, and so if we understood that better, I think there's reason to hope that we could rationally drive a larger percentage of people in that way. And so I think Xolair may very well be all that some people, need to feel like they're set, they got this covered. And I think it's going to be very likely an important part of the, toolbox, but I think for others, we want more.
So you've got Xolair, it's arguably a first generation technology for knocking down IgE. There are others that might be more powerful, more convenient, less frequently injected. that knock down your IgE. To my knowledge, I don't think that we really need our IgE all that much. They're used for what, like worms, right? Like our body
they protect they protect us from ectoparasites, worms, ticks, mites, maybe. Yeah, they also, there is a possibility that plays an important role in tumor surveillance. But
okay, so much for knocking down all of IgE indiscriminately then.
That's a little bit, there's animal models that say that, and there's kind of interesting epidemiological data that people with high IgEs have lower rates of some tumors. So, I think that's the thing, right, about the idea that we're going to put, everyone beginning at age 2 on Xolair for the rest of their life, right, is that there are these unknowns, even for something that's been around for millions of patient years,
So, so how about prevention?
Yeah.
How do we vaccinate people against developing food allergies?
Yeah. Well, fortunately, part of it literally is just expose them, right? So the good news is that there is going to be a substantial fraction of kids, who simply by getting the food into the diet early in life, we really can prevent this problem.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's going to make it go away. I think there are going to be some that even, no matter how early you try to go, it doesn't work. And it's also, it can be difficult, I think, for families to do. But I think that is going to be a big part of it. I don't think it's going to put me out of business, but it'd be great if it did.
So it's the opposite of the gut reaction that the field had,
right,
when first started to, get inklings as to who might be at risk. Ooh, let's avoid this. Now we're saying, don't avoid, expose your kid early, feed your kid all these different foods, soy, tree nuts, peanuts, egg, milk, you name it, sesame, which is a bit of a pain, when you think about, feeding a kid, right? And so I'm looking forward to the episode when we talk about what FAIR is doing now to sponsor a trial that, hopefully is going to really show what happens when you make a tremendous effort to expose kids early from month, like 4 or 5, for several years to all these different common food allergens. And based on what we saw with peanuts from that LEAP study, based on the hints of activity that we saw in the EAT study with, a variety of other foods, what if we could prevent the advent of the emergence of food allergies in like 80% or something like that of the kids that were destined to go on to get food allergies? You're right, it doesn't put you out of business, but it certainly makes it more manageable for you to field those texts and phone calls, from fewer worried people, right? RE Capital invested in a company once called Adeo that made a series of applesauce packets that each one of which contained a different food allergen, with the goal of making it easy for parents to expose their kids, to all these different food allergens. But in case, a reaction developed to one of them, you could pull that food packet. It's like, oh no, the kid got a reaction to, the fish packet, which, by the way, mixing applesauce and fish and have it still be like, having kids still eat it, that was really advanced technology, right? So, but if the kid has a reaction to one thing, you got to be able to pull that packet while you consider whether or not the kid has that allergy, while feeding all the other packets. That company went under. We couldn't crack the code for how to market the benefits of this to patients, how to make that medical claim that this isn't just some arbitrary different kind of applesauce. This is something that could help prevent food allergies, because technically we didn't have the clinical data to say so definitively. Mm-hmm. And yet, if any one company tried to pay for that study, to take it on itself to fund that study, it wouldn't be able to make that claim about its own product only, right? It's kind of like nutraceuticals. You can say that your cranberry extract prevents UTIs, but after you prove that, everybody else will say that about their cranberry extract as well, right? And so no one company wants to fund the research, and so no company does, and therefore none of them are able to make that medical claim that's needed. So I'm looking forward to talking about this prevention study to see how can we just once and for all prove this effect, that assuming that it's true, that if you just feed kids all these different kinds of foods, then you will prevent allergies, and now allow all the different food companies out there to rely on that study to go ahead and make that marketing claim and compete with one another on who can make the tastiest, formula plus fish mixture or whatever, or the most convenient form factor, some sort of, food wheel where which applesauce packet or something you're pulling out of the device and you're sticking to a regular schedule. Yeah. What are your thoughts on ultimately our chances of success there based on everything you've seen, about prevention?
I think they're good. I think the EAT trial, on a per protocol basis, it showed efficacy for a number of things. And the difficult thing was just, it's really hard to support families through all of that nutrition. One of the things I'm excited about, the study, and it's a really thoughtful group of people that are involved in the design. It's really been fun to be a small part of that, is the opportunity that we may have also to understand interactions in the environment. Like we're really bumping up here against, I would say, kind of the limits of, sort of the way our medical and regulatory and even to some extent the scientific process works, right? But it might be, for example, that what's really important is that, kids learn to eat early on what's important for their household and their culture. Right. And so by studying this really carefully and looking at, like everything down to dust samples and what allergens are there, I'm not only hopeful that we can show a generalized benefit that really, if you get allergens in early, it doesn't really matter what the allergen is, it's going to prevent, but maybe also gain a little bit of insight into essentially, how the immune system learns to eat. You know what I mean? And like, what's the interaction between anxiety and other exposures? And because if you think evolutionarily about like, why do we have this arm of the immune response? It's designed to protect us from toxic and noxious things in the environment. And I think, with modernity, we've kind of decoupled perhaps, that natural process a bit. And so again, it's like, we're not, the genie's not going back in the bottle. We know what IgE is now. We can't ignore those things, but hopefully we can understand it with a little bit of the bigger picture in mind. And so not only will we enable, those companies to compete and really make a big difference for people's lives, but maybe we'll also gain some insight into just like what's really important and required, in terms of immune development early in life. And maybe that will unlock some, some additional secrets.
I'm going to throw one more term that we haven't touched on. That's microbiome.
Yeah.
Right? All the different bacteria in our guts, and even.
Oh, you think that might be important? Yeah.
It's a growing field. I have to admit, though, I've seen that field make some pretty bold claims about a whole lot of different diseases. Microbiome and Alzheimer's, microbiome and autism, microbiome and cancer. What's the connection? The most credible connection between microbiome and food allergies?
The most credible connection to me, it still is probably, the model data. And what we understand about immune tolerance, and it's still not, things that we've 100% validated in humans, but I think are so compelling from the animal models that it's almost certainly an important factor.
What have you seen? What's like the weird result you've seen that tells you there's got to be something here?
Well, so for example, Talal Chatila at Children's, I don't know what microbiome expert you're going to have or experts later in your series, but those are going to be fun conversations, right? But he's literally shown he can take a genetically predisposed animal, because of a gain of function mutation in an immune pathway gene called the IL-4 receptor that spontaneously developed food allergy and other allergic disease. And he can transfer to healthy control litter mates due to microbiome, a propensity to develop allergies as well. So like, and these are the kinds of experiments that have been done in almost every other field, right? Where you've also, appropriately are giving a bit of a skeptical eye to, absolutely well justified, because until we kind of, validate some of these things in human disease, we need to be cautious. But these are powerful effects. The microbiome is, intimately associated with us over, evolutionary distances. And there's no doubt that it's extremely important in really any immune mediated disease, which is to say any disease, right? I mean, that's why I'm an immunologist, because it really touches on all of human health. So yeah, those are going to be fun. I look forward to listening to your episodes with some real microbiome experts, because I just dabble. But like, yes, it gets hyped a little bit sometimes, perhaps, but I think it is really going to eventually revolutionize, a lot of aspects of human health.
Well, I think the reason why it gets hyped is because there's so much promise there to answer questions that we just can't seem to account for. It's almost like dark matter, right? Yeah. Like, there's something there. There's got to be something there. And along comes this new field that says, are you ignoring the trillions of these other organisms that are constantly secreting all kinds of factors and are converting what you eat into the, the building blocks that you absorb? And not everybody has the same mixture, and they convert the same food into different things in different people. And so you start to say, wow, maybe that's the dimension within which the answers have been hiding. So it's cool to see that we're on the cusp. Well, we've been at this now for an hour. This has been great. And this is the first episode of what promises to be a series, I think, of 10. So we're going to be delving into each of these different topics that we've covered. We touched on diagnostics, prevention, therapies, microbiome. We'll be going into depth on each of those. And my goal, Wayne, is to have you listen to each one of those and be like, I learned something.
I look forward to it. I'm sure I will.
If somebody's who's as cutting edge as you can say, I learned something, then I know that we've done something good with this podcast series. So Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Peter. Good luck with the whole series. I look forward to it.
Thank you for joining us for this first episode of Future in Sight with Dr. Wayne Shrefler. Thank you so much, Wayne, for joining us. And until next time.